Good morning, Boker Tov, and welcome back to our Parsha perspectives for today, our weekly analysis of the Parsha, the Sedra, that week's Torah portion, with an emphasis on extracting the lessons that are relevant for us in contemporary times. We have many sponsors for today. I want to express our gratitude to them all. First of all, today's day of learning, Apple Graton Synagogue, is sponsored by Ron and Dr. Sid Cohen in honor of the birth of their granddaughter, Zahava Kaplan, daughter of Alyssa and Nachum Kaplan, sister to Devorah. Mazel Tov on that wonderful simcha. You should have a lot of nachas. The Parsha series is generously sponsored for the year by Becky and Avi Katz and family, loving memory of David Grossman. Le'ilu Nishmas, David ben Menachem Manish. So grateful to our dear friends the Katzes for their generosity in this area and in so many others. Thank you so much. Also, this morning's class is sponsored by Liz and Dr. Michael Michelle in honor of her father, Rabbi Irving Levy. Rabbi Yisrael Yitzchak Halevi ben Binyamin. His yahrzeit is on 11 Teves. May his neshama have an aliyah. And sponsored lastly by Carol Wald in honor of the yahrzeit of her beloved mother, Clarice Pressner. Thank you all for your generosity and for your sponsorship. Mazel tov on the simchas, and the neshamas of those for whom it is sponsored should have an aliyah. We are up to the final parsha of the book of Bereshis. We are closing the book. The curtain is coming down on the story of the formation, the development of the first family. A complicated story, a roller coaster story, a story of ups and downs, a story that hopefully goes from dysfunction to function, though we'll talk about this morning whether in fact it did that. Does the curtain come down with joy and happiness? Is there closure and reconciliation? Or is that wishful thinking? Have they never fully really reconciled? Yosef and his brothers, are they still in some ways at it? Not only when Bereshis closes, but even until this very day. That is part of our subject for this morning. Parshat Vayechi can be found in the Art Scroll Stone Chumash on page 268. If you have an Art Scroll Stone Chumash, for those who want to follow inside. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shvasrei shana. Vayehi yimei Yaakov shnei chayav sheva shanim ve'arba'im u'ma'as shana. Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim for 17 years. Rashi tells us in some ways these were the best years of his life. He had some peace, he had some closure, he had some degree of happiness. His family was back intact, everyone was safe, secure. They're living and thriving in the suburb of Goshen, where they've set up a yeshiva and a shul, and for 17 years Yaakov is able to have the shalva, the peace, the serenity that he had wanted before. Vayechi Yaakov, those words, Vayechi, Yaakov lived. Yaakov lived 17 years. But the word Vayechi means even more than Yaakov lived. See Rashi, Vayechi Yaakov, says Rashi, Lama Parsha Zu Stuma, Lefishakevan Shenefter Yaakov Avinu, Nistimu Einayim Velibon Shel Yisrael, Mitzaras Hashibot Sheischilu L'Shabdam. Rashi tells us that normally if you look in a Sefer Torah, normally if you look in a Chumash, you'll find that there's a space left in between Parshios. That Parsha ends and there's a space, there's margin, there's an empty klaf between the words that close the previous Parsha and the words that open the next Parsha. And yet, Parshas Vayechi is the one and only Parsha in the Torah, which is Stuma, in which it continues on one line, it continues one into the next. There is no space between Parshios Vayigash and Vayechi. Why is there no space? Why is there no break? What is the message that seeks to communicate? So Rashi tells us what it's communicating. It's Stuma because after Yaakov, once Yaakov died, Nistamu, just like the Parsha Stuma, it's a closed Parsha. Once Yaakov dies, Nistamu, the eyes and the hearts of the Jewish people became closed. What does it mean they became closed? The eyes and hearts became closed because of the tzara, because of the burden, because of the persecution, the oppression, because of the suffering at the hands of the Egyptians. When Yaakov died, this was the close of the Jewish people's serenity, prosperity. This was the close of the Jewish people's peace in Mitzrayim, and now they began to feel the shibud. Wolbe, Wolbe Zatzal, the great Mashgiach of Yerushalayim, asks a very compelling question. Again, so many of us have learned this Rashi so many times, and we gloss right over it. But if you stop and you think about it for even a moment, Wolbe's question is very compelling. We know that Shibud Mitzrayim, the tsaros of Mitzrayim, as Rashi calls them, did not begin when Yaakov died. When Yaakov died, his sons, the Shvatim, continued to outlive him. And we know that from the end of our Parsha, because in the end of our Parsha, the brothers and Yosef continue to have a conversation. Is there reconciliation? Have they moved on? They brothers ostensibly are communicating and transmitting a message from their father. That relationship continues. So if that relationship continues, then it means that the brothers continued and the Shibud Mitzrayim did not begin yet. So when did the Shibud Mitzrayim, when did the harshness of the exile first begin? When did it first begin? It began after the Shvatim, after all the tribes were gone, after the tribes died, not with the death of Yaakov. So what's Rashi telling us? That once it was Sasim. So listen to the insight of Rav Wolbe. Rav Wolbe in Shiur Chumash on our Parsha, Parshas Vayechi. He says that the bondage the Chazal we're referring to is not the physical enslavement. We're not talking about the physical oppression and suffering, but we're talking about a spiritual one. When Yaakov, their guide and their mentor, when Yaakov, that role model, disappeared, the Shvatim, his children, began to feel the influence of the Egyptian culture. As soon as Yaakov was gone, as soon as Yaakov left the scene, when Yaakov was there, he was successful in his barrier. Yaakov was a throwback, a connection to the past. Yaakov was able to give them what they needed in order to have a sense of confidence, a sense of identity, even as they lived among a foreign entity, even as they lived among the Egyptians. But once Yaakov died, once Yaakov left the scene, and now the Shvatim, his children, were on their own, they were struggling. And therefore the Rav Wolbe explains Rashi, they felt the bondage, not the physical bondage. The slavery and oppression, the servitude didn't kick in until all the Shvatim died. But once Yaakov was gone, Nistimu Ineim V'Liban Yisrael, their eyes and their hearts were closed. The role model, the person they could point to, the person they could see, was gone. And now the influence of Mitzrayim, the influence of this foreign culture, this foreign nation, this foreign people, could be felt. Those living in Chutz La'aretz are more susceptible to the influence of a non-Jewish culture, but it doesn't matter where you live in the world. If you don't attach yourself to a role model, if you don't have a Yaakov Avinu, if you don't connect to somebody who is a link in the chain to the past and who is a model and a precedent for a life of faith, for a life of devotion, for a life of Mesiras Nefesh, for a life of unwavering commitment to wanting to fulfill the Ratzon Hashem, the will of God, and to give him Nachas Ruach, it is so easy to fall prey. It is so easy to assimilate. It is so easy to become confused and distracted. That's what it means. Nistimu Ineim V'Liban Yisrael was not referring to the physical bondage, but the spiritual one, which is also a form of bondage that we all need to be aware of and we all need to be afraid of. Moving right along, the Parsha tells us that Yaakov is nearing the end of his life, and he has this great fear: don't bury me in Mitzrayim. I don't want this to capture my legacy. This is not where I want permanence, but rather take me to the land of my forefathers. Take me and bury me with those who come before. V'asisa imadi chesed ve'emes. Do for me both a chesed and emes. Rashi tells us this is the source of the notion. The work of the Chevra Kadisha of Tahara is chesed shel emes. When you take care of and when you do a chesed with those who are no longer among the living, there's no hope that they can repay. There's nothing they can give back in return. There's nothing they can do for us. And therefore, that is the ultimate chesed. That is the highest level of chesed that we can hope for. That is the highest chesed. It's what we call a chesed ve'emes. V'shachavti im avosai. I want to sleep in perpetuity. I want to achieve immortality. I want to be forever with avosai, with those who come before me. Anochi aseket varecha. And he answered, Yosef made the promise. Hishavali, Yaakov didn't take it for granted. He didn't trust, so to say. He said, make me a promise. I want to know. I want to know that you fulfill your word. I want to know that you really mean it. Yosef makes him the promise, and he bows down al Rosh Hamita. And from here we know the Shekhinah dwells. The Shekhinah can be found. God's presence can be intensely felt. Where? It can be intensely felt at the head of the bed of a sick person. That is where Hashem is most accessible. Perak Mem Ches Vayachar Dvarim Ha'il. It's after these things. Vayomer Yosef Hinei Avicha Choleh. Vayikach Shnei Vanav Yimos Menashe Ephraim. It's reported to Yosef, your father is sick. Your father is terminally ill. It's time to bring your children, his grandchildren, Menashe and Ephraim, for a bracha, and he does that. Before we get to the Hishavali, the promise, the oath. Let's look at our first Rav Druck. We're going to see several insights of Rav Yisrael Meir Druck, the Eish Tamid. That's what we've been studying this year in the Parsha class. We've been invoking a lot the son of the great Drash Mordechai, the Maggid of Yerushalayim. But this is Rav Yisrael Meir Druck, Rosh Hashiva today in Yerushalayim. In his Eish Tamid, he writes the following: that Yaakov tells Yosef, promise me, and Yosef promises. And Rashi tells us Rosh Hamita, I alluded to it, Rosh Hamita, Rasha. What does it mean, the head of the bed? Yaakov's bed was full. Ein bo Rasha. Yaakov realizes right now among his children he had achieved something that his predecessors hadn't. Avram had a Yitzchak, but he also had a Yishmael. And Yitzchak had a Yaakov, but he also had a Yosef. And Yaakov had Shivteka. Shra Yosef Melachu, Vod Shenish B'Lamein Agoyim, V'Rei Omed B'Tzidko. Yosef was a king, and Yosef was living among the Gentiles, and yet he had not compromised an iota of who he was and who he was meant to be. Says Rav Druck Mavur, Yaakov Ishtachav V'Hod LaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shezacha Shemitaso Shleima. Yaakov at this moment is overwhelmed. He's on his deathbed. It's the end of his life. He is reflective, he is nostalgic, and he's looking at all he's been through. A roller coaster of ups and downs, of conflict, of tension, of impermanence. And here he is now surrounded by his loved ones, surrounded by his family, thinking about the end of his life and his legacy. And the one loose end, his Yosef, who had been missing for 22 years, the one loose end, his Yosef, who he was concerned and suspected had not only disappeared physically, but who he was worried had strayed and disappeared spiritually. Now Yosef, who's risen to the level of Viceroy of Egypt, Yosef is still with the program. Yosef is still with the plan. Yosef has raised a Menashe and an Ephraim, and therefore he feels full, he feels complete, he feels whole. And Rosh Hamita. Davar Tema wonders, Rav Druck, how peculiar. In Cain, Madu Lahoda Yaakov Advar Ze Elach Rishnish B'La Yosef Shalokavar B'Mitzrayim. Rashi is telling us in this pasuk, and at this moment, it's at this time that Yaakov feels, I'm whole, I'm complete. I finally feel a sense of comfort. Why now? Why did it take Yosef promising you he wouldn't bury you in Egypt? How about when you first descended to Egypt? Okay, when you saw the hint and the signal of the agalos of the wagons, that wasn't enough to convince you. Okay, maybe that I understand. We spoke about previously last week and years before what the message was. Maybe then you had to come and see for yourself. Seeing is believing. You had to see with your own eyes. But once you got down to Mitzrayim, Yaakov, and once you're living and seeing Yosef, you're learning with his children, so exhale. Now you can breathe a sigh of relief. Now you know you're whole, you're complete. Why does it only take until Yosef makes the promise? What is it about the promise that finally assures Yaakov, that gives Yaakov finally that sense of comfort that he can exhale? In the continuation of the Parsha, when Yaakov is giving a bracha to Yosef, it says, and Rash and Unkelos there translates, Mavur, Sheyada Yaakov Sheyosef Kaim is called Torah v'mitzvos b'seiser. V'inke madua rak ato shtachel v'hodam mitasu hashlema. The Targum tells us that Yaakov knew that while Yosef, Yosef maybe didn't wear a yarmulke to work. I'm sure he did. I'm not gossiping about Yosef. But we know that until recently, there were many, my father and father-in-law among them, the previous generation, righteous, religious, devoted, holy Erlich Yidden, holy Jews, who the circumstances didn't allow to wear a yarmulke to work. And yet, they were unflinching in washing before they eat, making a bracha when they came out of the bathroom. They figured out a way. And says the Targum, so Yaakov knew about Yosef, that while Yosef operated at the highest echelons of government, while Yosef lived in the palace and served as the viceroy, he was unflinching, uncompromising, unequivocal in his personal observance. So why not until now? Why is Yaakov only satisfied? Why does Yaakov only feel whole or complete now? What took so long? Why not earlier? V'nira bir bezesa, says Rav Druck, here's his suggestion. Shebevadai kvar yada Yaakov kodem lachein sheyosef kaimis kol Torah b'seiser. Yaakov knew earlier on that Yosef was being observant privately. Aval dayin lo raz yiras hashamayim shelo b'po mamish. But if Yosef was doing it privately, if Yosef was able to mumble a bracha in the corner, he held up the phone to make it look like he was on the phone when he was davening mincha, how did Yaakov really witness? How did he know? How did he know the passion, the energy, the enthusiasm? How did he really know? When you ask someone to take an oath is invoking God's name. And when a person who's God-fearing invokes God's name, they do so with an enormous sense of seriousness and sobriety. It brings out a sense of Yiras Shamayim. One of the tests of a person's seriousness is how seriously they take using Hashem's name. When God said, in fact, in the Ten Commandments, Lo sisa kol ha'olam izdazeya, when Hashem said, don't take my name in vain, the Chazal tell us, Gemara in Shavuos, Aflam Tes, that the whole world shook. The whole world was shaking at the thought of taking God's name in vain. God's name is our connection to Him. Kiddush, Hashem, Chilal Hashem, Nekadeshash Shimcha Barabim. When we talk about God's name, we're talking about God's essence. We're talking about how God manifests and expresses himself to us. We're talking about the way we access him and our relationship with him. And therefore, to take his name in vain is to take him in vain. So when Hashem said, don't ever invoke my name in vain, don't say my name when you don't mean it, don't make a promise, a pledge, a swear, an oath with my name when it's untrue, you're desecrating, you're violating, you're corrupting everything I stand for. So it was specifically with this. This was the litmus test. Yaakov knew. If you'd ask Yaakov, of course he knew. My Yosef is observant. My Yosef is Erlich. My Yosef gets it. How do you know? I know. Have you seen it? Not for myself, but I know. Now with the Shavua, when he sees the way in which he takes the seriousness of making this promise and this oath, Kashara Yaakov Ketzad Nishba Yosef, Haven She Yosef Hare Omid B'Tzidko. Yosef is righteous, and Yosef is virtuous, and Yosef is serious. Odiyesh Lavar, but furthermore you can explain, Shari Bikesh Meno Yaakov Lasim Yado Tachas Yerecho, Velo Ne'enelo, Kamo Shabir B'Targim Yonasan, Shabishvish Yosef Ayi Benoshel Yaakov, V'Chazal Asur L'chnos Merchatzim Aviv. When Yaakov said, I need you to take an oath, and here's what you need to do. When a person makes a promise, and here the non-Jewish courts have, or non-Jewish systems, have followed us. They put their hand on the Bible and make a promise. Where did that come from? You put your hand on a Bible. Because if we want you to take it seriously at the moment you're making the promise, you rest your hand on a mitzvah. There was no Bible. There was no mitzvah other than the bris milah. And therefore, in reference or association with the bris milah, was the way a person would most seriously take their promise. But Yosef hesitated. And why did Yosef hesitate? Aside from the obvious reasons why it seems inappropriate. But Yosef hesitated because Smag writes in Los Asay Mitzvah Kuf Chav Zayin that also lichnos al merchatzim aviv. A person should not go into the bathhouse with their father. You don't go to the locker room with your father. You don't change in the changing room with your father. Because it's not proper. It's not respectful. Yosef didn't want to. He thought that was a violation of Kibbud Av. Yosef thought that it wasn't appropriate. So he didn't respond immediately. He hesitated at using that symbol of a mitzvah of righteousness in order to make the promise. So therefore, it was the dual. What Yaakov witnessed was both the seriousness with which Yosef took the promise, the Shvuah, and moreover, coupled with Yosef's knowledge and awareness of respect, the mitzvah of Kibbud Av, that he didn't want to violate that boundary. And when you combine the two, Yaakov says, now I feel shalem. Mitaso shlema she'im barasha. Now I know that my Yosef is not only a tzaddik in private, my Yosef is not only a tzaddik when no one's looking, but now I've witnessed, now I can affirm his tzidkus, his righteousness. Okay, continuing right along. Now we can move. Perek Memches. After this, they bring the brothers. Yaakov told your son Yosef is coming. Yisrael. Now we transition. Yaakov was told, and who sits upright in bed? Who strengthens himself? Who strengthens himself? Yisrael. Note throughout our Parsha and really throughout Sefer Bereshis and Chumash, when do we refer to him as Yaakov, and when do we refer to him as Yisrael? Pay attention, pay close attention, because Yaakov represents the vulnerable. Yaakov represents the transient. Yaakov represents the mere mortal. Yisrael represents the greater entity. Yisrael represents the covenantal community. Yisrael represents immortality and eternity. So Yaakov is told, Yaakov on his deathbed is told, but what does it mean by Yischazek? What he summons within himself is his sense of Yisrael, his sense of eternity and immortality, his sense of the future of the Jewish people, his sense of transcendence, his sense of being bigger than the individual, but rather being something so much more, the Jewish people. Vayomer Yaakov Yosef, and Yaakov tells Yosef, God appeared to me and he gave me a bracha, and he told me I would multiply and I'd inherit the land, and now your two sons who are Noladim Bacha Be'eretz Mitzrayim, your two sons who were born here in Egypt, Ad Bo Yelechem Mitzrayim Alihem, they're mine. Ephraim and Menashe, Reuven v'Shimon Yali. Ephraim and Menashe, your two sons, they're like Reuven and Shimon. And we know halachically this matters. Halachic implications. That Ephraim and Menashe, though they are grandchildren, they're a level down from the Shvatim. Nevertheless, Yaakov promotes them. And Yaakov says they have the status of Reuven and Shimon. Yosef, you're not counted among the tribes, but rather Ephraim and Menashe are. So machlokas rishonim, did they each receive different territory, or did they receive the same territory of Yosef? Are they really treated as two tribes, or are they symbolically referenced or counted as two tribes? Exactly how far that goes is not for now, but Yaakov elevates Ephraim and Reuben Keruben v'Shimon. And he's going to give them the bracha we'll come to in a moment, but first we have to ask a question. Vani, as for me, says Yaakov, Bevoi mi Padan, when I was coming from Padan, Mesa alai Rachel be'eretz Canaan baderech, be'od kivras eretz lavo Ephrasa. Oh, when it came to me, Rachel died on me. Mesa alai Rachel. I point out every year, I always find this pasuk startling. This pasuk sounds to me, lahavdil, comes across, it sounds almost like she's a used car. Mesa alai Rachel. Your mother up and died on me. Could you believe it? 100,000 miles. Mesa alai. She died on me. That car. She died on me. The camel. Can you believe my laptop? Myself. She died on me. Mesa alai. She died on me. Be'eretz Canaan, on the way. Like as if Rachel inconvenienced Yaakov by dying on him. He was on the journey. He was on the way. He had a large family. What was she doing inconveniencing him? Why'd she have to go and die on him? Mesa alai Rachel, on the way. And I buried her there. B'derech Efrasi Beis Lachem. And I buried her there on the side of the road to Ephras, which is Beis Lachem. Vayar Yisrael's b'nei Yosef. Then Yisrael sees the children of Yosef and he says, who are they? So all the Rishonim jump on this. And all the Rishonim wonder, what in the world is going on here in these psukim? Yaakov is moved to give a bracha. Yosef summons his grandchildren. And Yaakov sees them and he says, these are no ordinary grandchildren. These don't have a level of grandchildren. No. Ephraim and Menashe, Keruben, and Shimon Yuli. They're elevated. They're like children. They count as tribes. But by the way, before I ask who they are, even though I just spoke about them, let me reference a little history. Your mother up and died on me when we were on the way. And I had to bury her on the side of the road. I had no choice. Oh, okay, back to these boys. Who are they and what's going on? What in the world is happening here? What's going on in this interaction? What's going on in this back and forth in this conversation? Why here? Why now? And what is Yaakov trying to communicate with this story about Rachel dying? And why here? And why here? So it would seem, let's look at Rashi. Let's look at Rashi before I tell you what would seem. Rashi tells us, Vayikbara, and I buried her. Yeah. Let's do the Rashi. Pasuk Zayin. V'afa pisha ani matriach alecha lelichin likaber be'eretz Canaan, v'lo kach hasis li'imecha asher imesa samach lebeis lachem. Rashi says, you know why Yaakov's invoking this here? What's the promise that Yaakov just asked from Yosef? Do me a favor. I know it won't be convenient. I know it won't be comfortable. I know it will be hard. The Mefarshim will explain. It was particularly hard for Yosef. Why? Yosef's the viceroy. He's living in Egypt. You're not going to bury your father in Egypt? Where's your patriotism? Where's your loyalty? Don't you believe this is your future? Why are you going to another country? Yosef had to worry that he would be accused. Unfortunately, this is a realized fear in our time, that he had to worry that he was going to be accused of what? Dual loyalty. Dual loyalty. You're taking your father to Canaan, you're taking your father to Israel. Where's your loyalty? Not bury him here. So Yaakov says, I know I'm inconveniencing you. I know I'm asking you to do something difficult. And you're probably wondering, and you probably want to ask me, hey Dad, Abba, you want me to leave my comfort zone? You want me to potentially get in trouble with Paro? All to take you far away, a long journey, an arduous trip to bury you elsewhere. But my mother you deposited on the side of the road? My mother who died in childbirth, you just buried conveniently where you were? Why didn't you inconvenience yourself? Why didn't you make that effort? Why didn't you struggle? Why didn't you go to extraordinary lengths to take her to Maras Machpelah with you? Why did you simply deposit her and bury her on the side of the road? So Rashi says that's what Yaakov is anticipating Yosef might ask, and that's why he's inserting it punct right here and in this spot. Even though I am burdening you with taking me to bury me elsewhere, and I didn't do that for your mother, you need to know, I didn't even take her into the city. I didn't even bury her in the town cemetery of Beis Lachem. I buried her on the side of the road. Why? I know that you have a grievance against me. I know that you don't understand it and you're wondering why and how. Aval dalacha, says Rashi, you need to know, Shapiadibor kvarti Hashem, that I buried her because divinely I was told. It was prophecy. God wanted her there. Why? Why would God want her there? Because when Nebuzaradan, the Babylonian evil, wicked general, would exile them, and they would pass Hayovrim Derech Sham, and the way out of Israel to Babylonia to exile was exactly past this road. Mama Rachel will rise up and she will see the Jewish people being led into exile, and she will advocate like only a mother can. She will cry like only a mother can. And she will plead and beg for mercy for children like only a mother can. Shenemar kol b'Rama nishma, the pasuk in Yirmiyah, Perek Lamed Aleph. V'Hakadosh Baruch Hu mevia meshiva, and Hakadosh Baruch Hu is going to answer. Yesh schar le'upulasech nu Hashem v'shavu vanim ligvulam. That hope and that optimism, that promise of our return to the land comes on the back of the sincere prayer of Rachel Imenu, of our Mama Rachel. So says Yaakov Avinu, according to Rashi, why is he mentioning it here? Where does this come from? Mesa alai Rachel, she died on me on the way like a car that died. And I deposited her, I buried her there instead of making the effort to take her with me. And I know Yaakov, I know Yosef rather, you're wondering, I've just asked to inconvenience you, I've asked you to go to extraordinary lengths, and when it came to me, I just deposited her there. How and why? How could I do that? I know that's what you're wondering. Here's the reason. I didn't do it randomly. I didn't do it by chance. It was by design. The Almighty Hashem divinely inspired and told me to put her there. And why did she need to be there, says Rashi? Fast forward to Yirmiyahu and Navi. Because when the Jews would be exiled, Nebuzaradan, the Babylonian general, would take them out of their land, she would rise up and daven. She would advocate as only a Mama Rachel, as only a mother could. And with that, he turns to Yosef and tries to explain. The Ramban wonders where Rashi sees this in the text. If you look at the Ramban, there's a lot I want to cover, so we're not going to look at this Ramban inside. But the Ramban wonders, where is this in the text? And he says, maybe that's what Yaakov meant when he said, Mesa alai badarach, she died on the way. Why did the text have to tell us she died on the derech, on the way? Just tell us she died, and tell us where she was buried. Why does it describe where she died? So suggests the Ramban, maybe that's what Rashi saw, was in the words on the road, that there would be something about being buried adjacent to the road which is significant, which would be Yaakov's defense, which would be the explanation. And that's why it says the road, and the road indicates she needed to be buried there. But the Ramban gives his own interpretation. He doesn't like Rashi. And the Ramban gives his own interpretation to what in the world is going on here. And he says Yaakov wants to explain to Yosef, don't be angry that his mother was not buried in Maras Machpelah. Why? Because she died in the land of Canaan and was not buried outside of Israel, while Yaakov's burial was going to be in the land of Egypt. She died suddenly on the road. He couldn't bury her there. How could he leave his children and cattle on the road and go with her to Machpelah? It would have taken him and his entourage many days. He would have abandoned his family. Who would have taken care of them? So says the Ramban, maybe what Yaakov is trying to suggest to Yosef is a contrast. She died in Israel, and she's buried in Israel. I am scheduled to die in Egypt. So you can't compare. It's true I'm asking you to do something extraordinary, but the alternative to it is a final resting place in Egypt, and I don't want to be there. Your mother died at least in Israel, and that's where she was buried, albeit not in Maras Machpelah, but at least she is buried in the eternal resting place of the Jewish people. It wasn't possible. The Ramban understands that Yaakov's offering a defense. Yosef, don't be frustrated, don't be upset. This is unspoken. I know it's many years that we never addressed this, but I want you to know why. I want you to know why, and the reason is I couldn't. I wasn't practical. I had young children. I had a family. I had people who relied on me. I couldn't do it. The Sforno offers another interpretation. Sforno has another pshat. We're again on Perek Memches and Pasuk Zayin. The Sforno, Rav Avadia Sforno, the great Italian exegete, says the following. He says, where's the Sforno? Mesa alai Rachel Sforno. Sorry, just finding the place. Yeah. Vani shema tomer k'shani elai ha'el yisaleh ha'kavanah shel banim ela shegar machet zelo yitachen. Maybe you'll say that he's going to have more children. It was impossible. But voimi padan kishen nigla alai az hakel yisaleh. When I was exiled, when God sent me on the path, when we were on the way, mesa alai Rachel. Ki amram ein isha mesa ella labayla. Chazal, our rabbis tell us in Sanhedrin Chav Beis, you know who feels the loss of a loved one most? Is it the children? Is it the nephews and nieces? Is it the rabbi, the friends? Who feels it the most? Says the Gemara, Ein isha mesa ella labayla. When a spouse dies, nobody feels it as profoundly, nobody feels it as acutely, painfully as the spouse. The spouse lost their other half. The spouse lost a piece of themselves. The spouse lost a partner. The spouse experiences a extraordinary loneliness. Ein isha mesa ela labayla. B'derech ba'od kivras eretz lavo efrasa. Tekef kishenasati me'osa makom she'edaber ala kel yizala. Ba'od b'derech ter miyani. V'ekbar, and I buried her there. V'kol kach gavra alai tiradati v'avolosi shlo atzarti koch laholicha lebeis kvaros beis lachem. Says Sforno, you know why she's buried on the side of the road? Because ein isha mesa ela labayla. You don't understand. It's true, you kids, you lost your mother. You, Yosef and Binyamin, you lost your mother. It's true. Binyamin didn't even know her. Rachel died in childbirth. She never really met her son, Binyamin. And Yosef, you weren't there. But you know, it's true, the pain of children. But nobody felt the pain like I did. And I was my grief ran so deep and so painful. I just didn't have what it took. I simply couldn't get it together and muster the strength to bring her to the Beis Lachem cemetery. I didn't have the koach laholicha lebeis kvaros beis lachem. Ve'in safek kimeaz hayali bichalol bekirbi, and there's no question that from then there was a hole in my heart. V'lo shalat od biyetzahara lislach lech bechet v'lo nisher bikoach lo lidbanim. My Yetzirah was destroyed. My desires were weakened. I had no more strength to have any more children. That was it. So the Sforno explains, why is Yaakov invoking this here? He's sharing with Yosef a deep secret. Yosef, I never told you, I never told anyone. But when your mother died, I was crippled with sadness. When your mother died, I was paralyzed by the sense of loss. When your mother died, I put one foot in front of the other, and I did what it took because I had children and a family. But you need to know that inside, I had nearly nothing left. So maybe you're upset and resentful, but I want you to know the reason I didn't take her to bury her there is I simply didn't have anything left to do it. I find these maforshim so powerful because this is a conversation that Yaakov and Yosef needed to have. It's a deathbed conversation, but it doesn't need to be. They're all conversations that children and parents, all conversation that relationships in all directions need to have, and they don't need to wait for the deathbed. There are unasked questions that should be asked. There are answers and explanations that should be offered. There are clarifications that deserve to happen. And not always will everyone be satisfied with what's offered. But in order to have a sense of completion, in order to have closure, there are conversations. And I can tell you as a rabbi that is regularly counseling at the deathbed, people wait until it's too late. They wait till their loved one is compromised or is terminal or they're unable to bring up these topics because they're concerned. But you know, when they lose the loved one, now there's no closure. Now it remains forever unexplained. And here's a beautiful example as the Torah teaches us something from so many years ago but relevant today. The importance of these conversations at the end of life. And Yaakov is essentially turning on its head and he's saying, Yosef, you're bitter, you're resentful, you need to know what I was going through. Ein isha mesa ela labayla. Ein isha mesa ela labayla. Sometimes you have children who are resentful of the way a parent behaves when their other parent was dying. But they don't know the profound pain that the surviving parent was enduring because it was never communicated. It remained unspoken when it should have been. So Rashi says, I want you to know, this wasn't me. God told me to bury your mother there, and it was a plan. She needed to be there because when the Jewish people would be exiled, Mama Rachel needed to be there to daven for them. And the Sforno says, and the Ramban says, no, that's not what's going on. What's going on is Yaakov says, I was being a responsible parent. You don't know, but you don't realize. If I would have made the effort to go to Masa Machpelah and would have left everyone alone, you never would have made it. I had to stay back. That was the responsible thing. And the Sforno offers a third interpretation. He says Yaakov is telling Yosef, I didn't have what it took. I was broken inside. I was hollow and empty inside. You have no idea the depth of my grief. I simply didn't have what it took. Look at it through my eyes. Look at it and live it through my perspective. The Chizkuni offers two more interpretations. Listen to the Chizkuni. Says the Chizkuni, Number one, the Chizkuni says, I wasn't yet secure in the cave. For when I was on the road, Esav was still claiming it. You want and wish for me to have buried your mother, where ultimately Leah and I are buried? I couldn't. Esav controlled the cave at the time. Esav was wrestling me over that cave. He claimed it was his. I simply couldn't. So I buried her on the road. But, Kishkavarti is Leah, Mechvar halach lo Esav al eretz v'iniach li Yaakov. He's quoting Tanchuma, Chizkuni. By the time I buried Leah, the cave was clearly mine. Esav had relinquished any hope of ownership, any claim over it, and therefore I was able to bury Leah. So you can't have a taina, you can't have a grievance against me. I couldn't bury your mother there. I had no choice but to put her on the side of the road. It wasn't an option for me, number one. Number two, Ekbarasham, ki yadati ki yoso gvul yala l'chelik banea, ukvoda liyoso nigberes bechelik baneha. I knew this border would eventually belong to her descendants, and it'd be an honor for her to be buried in the portion that belonged to her children. But had I buried her in the cave in Kvartia b'Ma'ara, ain't so kvoda. Shohi b'chelko shel Yehuda ben Leah. Where is Maras Machpelah? Within the division of the land of Israel, among the tribes. Where does Chevron, where does Maras Machpelah fall out? It falls out in the portion of Yehuda. Yehuda is the son of whom? Of Leah, Rachel's co-wife. So for Rachel to be interred in the portion of her co-wife of Yehuda, the son of Leah, that wouldn't have been respectful. What was more respectful, Yaakov is telling Yosef, is, I buried her here, near Beis Lachem, and that is in the portion of her children. And that is the greater respect. That is the greater respect. And then a third interpretation of the Chizkuni, he says, Yaakov buried her there, he says, I could have been it would have been a disgrace to transport her to the Machpelah. Why? Because her blood might have soiled. She would have been in her burial garments, and there was no ice packs. Today, when we transport a person to be buried in New York, to be buried in Eretz Yisrael, we have special packaging and transportation and ice pack and cooler. It didn't exist then. He says, if I would have taken her to Mars Machpelah, her body would have begun to decay, and that would not have been respectful at all. So we've seen many, many interpretations. Rashi, a couple in the Ramban, the Sforno, 3 in the Chizkuni, all different and all kinds of interpretations. Rashi, it was prophetic. She needed to be there for when the children would emerge and when the children would ultimately come out. And that is the vision of our Mama Rachel. The vision of our Mama Rachel, that she stands by the side and she davens for us in a way like nobody else could. That is the image and the vision of our Mama Rachel, who sits on the side of the road. The Lubavitcher Rebbe Zatzal explains beautifully that Hashem wanted Rachel Imenu to be buried roadside because Rachel Imenu continues to sacrifice for her children. Rachel Imenu, Parshas Vayechi, Rashi tells us, was the Akeres Abayis. She was the one willing to sacrifice. She was Moshe Nefesh. She was the one who gave the taste and the flavor and the atmosphere to the home. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, based on this, that women are exempt mitzvah seishazman groma. Women should never be conflicted. There should never be a tension, a competition. Where are they going to give their love and attention? To Hashem or to their children? So Hashem says, no, don't worry about me. If there's a time-bound mitzvah and you can't get it all in, then forfeit me. Don't daven mincha. Don't sit in this. Don't do this. Don't do the mitzvah for me. Stay with your husband. Stay with your children. The Nashim Tzidkanios, this is the image of Rachel Imenu, who is forever in perpetuity Mama Rachel. She is Rachel Imenu, this woman who was barren for so many years, who wanted more than anything. She had the husband. She scored Yaakov, while Leah, all she wanted to do was be Yaakov's wife. Rachel had Yaakov, and yet all she wanted was to be a mother. And that is how she is remembered. That's how she is memorialized in perpetuity. She's Mama Rachel. She is Rachel Imenu. And so Yaakov's telling Yosef, yeah, bury me in Maras Machpelah, but your mother needed to be buried along the road, because your mother is a mama. She's Moshe Nefesh, and she is willing to be sacrificed. She was willing to not be in Kever. She was willing to not be in Maras Machpelah in order to remain closer to you. That is the extension of Rashi. The Ramban says it wasn't possible. Svarno says, I was paralyzed by grief. I couldn't do it. Chizkuni says, Esav had the Mara. I couldn't get her there. Or number 2, it's a greater honor to be buried in her portion, not another. Or lastly, Kavod Ames. Maybe the Tachrichin would have been soiled. I didn't have that chance. The Ramban has a final interpretation. And listen to the final interpretation. A 7th interpretation. Says the Ramban, you know why Yaakov is telling Yosef, I didn't bury her there? Listen to this, it's wild. Because Yaakov says, the fact that I married 2 sisters is against the Torah. In the Torah, a person is not allowed to be married to 2 sisters. So how did I do it? How could I be married to 2 sisters? It was a horasha. It was an exception. For whatever reason, the genetics, the spiritual DNA of a Rachel and of a Leah needed to combine with Yaakov to yield the Shiftei Ka, the 12 tribes. For whatever reason, it was a temporary exception to the rule. But Yaakov says, what it would look like if the Jews for thousands of years would come to Maras Machpelah and I would be buried there with 2 sisters, what that would look like and what it would say about me, that I was in continued violation of Torah to be associated with and buried with 2 sisters. It couldn't be. I couldn't have it. And so instead I lie next to Leah, but Mama Rachel Imenu, sits on the roadside. She cries and she rises for her children, for whom she is the most loyal advocate, a loving mother who can step up and stand up in ways that nobody else can. So we saw 7 interpretations, and whichever one speaks to you, they could have multiple truths. Maybe many of them are compelling to you. But what I want to draw your attention to is not which of the interpretations you find most compelling, as much as the importance of having these conversations. Don't wait. Don't delay. Don't leave things unresolved, but have the conversations that need to happen, even if it simply is offering a clarification so that it doesn't remain unresolved for survivors, for successors, for those who will remain behind. Perek Memches Pasuk Yidal, moving right along. Now he gives the bracha to Ephraim and to Menashe. Vayishlach Yisrael Simino Vayechi Rosh Ephraim v'hu Hatza'ir v'Smola Rosh Menashe. Sikelas Yadav ki Menashe Bachor. We all know the story that Menashe is on Yaakov's right because he's older, and the right side is the greater side, and Ephraim was younger than the left side. But Yaakov pulls the old switcheroo and he crosses his hands and he puts his right hand on the younger one, Ephraim's left hand on Menashe, the older one. Yosef and he gives a bracha to Yosef and he says, God who walked before me, before my forefathers, Avram and Yitzchak, which translates as God. What's haro eosi? Art Scroll translates it as God who shepherds me. Elokim haro eosi, God who shepherds me. So it's all set up. Menashe and Ephraim. Yaakov switches his hands. Instead of going right to Ephraim and Menashe, first he gives a bracha to Yosef. And the bracha to Yosef is introduced with God who I love and loves me, God of my fathers, Avram and Yitzchak. God haro'eh osi. What does the word haro'eh osi mean? So Art Scroll translates haro'eh as, what's a ro'eh? A shepherd. Ha'elokim haro'eh means God who shepherded me. He shepherds me through my life. He is the shepherd of my life. But the Rabbi Soloveitchik Chumash translates it differently, based on the Ramban. The Ramban says the word ro'eh means a shepherd. But the root of the word shepherd of ro'eh is re'ah. Re'ah is a friend. And therefore the OU, Rabbi Soloveitchik Chumash translates, Ha'elokim ha'ro'eh osi is not God who shepherded me, but God who befriended me. Kadosh Baruch Hu is my closest friend. I'm never alone. I confide, I lean, I love, I feel His love. Ha'elokim haro'eh osi. It's one of the most beautiful psukim in the Torah, if you understand like the Ramban. Ha'elokim haro'eh osi means Yosef, I give you a bracha. That do you know that God has been my best friend? Me'odi, from when I was born, on Hayom Hazeh until today. Throughout my life, when Dinah was captured and raped, when Esav wanted to kill me, when this happened and I was on the road and on the run, when Lavan pulled the old switcheroo, throughout my life and all that I had to endure, Ha'elokim haro'eh osi. God was my best friend, Me'odi, from my inception on Hayom Hazeh until today. Yosef, that's what I want you to know. And that is the biggest bracha. The biggest bracha is to know that the Ribono Shel Olam, the Eibishter, is your best friend. Talk to him, lean on him, and live with him. Haro'eh osi. I love that pshat. I love that explanation. It is so powerful. But back to Rav Druck. Rav Druck number 2 wonders the following. Rav Druck number 2 wonders the following. Tzarach biur. Madua Yaakov hutzrach lasas pula Mr. Belas kazu shalafichas yadayim. Why is Yaakov crossing his hands? What's with the old switcheroo? Hello Yachol lasas both in Parsha b'Yoser. Why doesn't it just say switch places? Yaakov's not shy. Why can't Yaakov just tell them, fellas, boys, switch places? Why doesn't he tell them Menashe on the left, Ephraim on the right? Why does he pull the old switcheroo? Crosses his hands. What's going on? Harosh b'perushu ala Torah, bir shezeh bo haTorah levar b'mesha amra, sikel es yadav ki Menashe habechor. Klomar, b'shvil Menashe shaya bechor lo asa l'shiyachol ela sikel yadayim. Ratzolomer hirkiv hayadayim v'azroso agavzu, v'sama yamin al Ephraim v'asmol al Menashe, she'el mole lo haya bechor yamachlif ma'avir mitzad yamin al smol, v'zui nesinas tam. The Torah is giving us the answer in the same pasuk that raises the question. The question was, why does the Torah say he switched his hands? And the answer is, Ki Menashe HaBechor, because he wanted to preserve the dignity and the honor of Menashe. So yes, he wanted to channel through the right, through the greater hand to Ephraim, the younger one, but he wanted to preserve the dignity of Menashe to leave him on the right. V'chein kosav ha'cheskuni, sikels yadav asa inyana behasechel uv'chachma. The word sikel, which means to switch, also has the same root as the word seichel. That Yaakov wasn't doing this randomly or haphazardly. Yaakov was doing this thoughtfully and by design, strategically. He should have told the boys, switch places. But instead, he crossed his hands. Why? He did not want to embarrass Menashe. Because Menashe was the Bechor, and he didn't want him to be embarrassed. His chalasos b'chach marak la'afach his yadav. So instead of asking him to switch places, he took it upon himself to switch his hands in order not to embarrass Menashe. V'chein bir b'sefer Noam Elimelech, the Hiliger of Elimelech of Lezhinsk, the great Rebbe writes, Lim the Torah derech eretz, sheyinog adam kavod b'chaveru lefi hara'i lo. Person always has to show honor to the person who deserves it. Give him a seat on the mizrach, give him a seat at the table. Point, and therefore Menashe was older, and by virtue of being the Bechor, he deserved to be on the right. Yes, Yaakov had to redirect, rechannel across his hands, but it didn't take the easier route, which was to switch them. He took the harder route, which was to hold his hands in that position. Hard for an old man on his deathbed, but he went the harder route because he took it upon himself. Better for him to work harder, but not embarrass Menashe, than it would be to embarrass Menashe. What an important lesson. But says Rav Druck, you could also explain it a little bit differently. Why didn't he switch him? Because it says in the pasuk before, Vayikach Yosef Ephraim b'mino mismol Yisrael v'Menashe b'smolo mimino Yisrael. Tzarach bir. Why didn't it just say Ephraim mismol Yisrael? Why doesn't it say Ephraim was on the left of Yisrael and Menashe was on the right of Yisrael? Why does it say b'mino mismol Yisrael, on his right, which was the left of Yisrael? In other words, the Torah here is narrating from the perspective of Yosef. He says, Ephraim, who was on Yosef's right, who was on Yaakov's left. Just say he was on Yaakov's left. What's really relevant here is how they were positioned vis-a-vis Yaakov. Yaakov's the one giving the bracha. Yaakov's the one who has to hold his hands and cross them. So what do we care how they appeared from the perspective of Yosef? Why does the Torah communicate it in such a backwards, peculiar way? V'nira mavur shem Yosef savar sheish lasis malav chashivas l'Ephraim, ela shechshiva l'Ephraim b'zeh shenosna b'yamina shalo, u'b'zeh edifu Menashe b'smola shalo, she'af yamina she Yosef b'shas l'brachos yesh l'chashivas miyuchedes. Because the Torah wants us to know that even though Ephraim was on the left of Yaakov, from Yaakov's perspective, Ephraim was on Yosef's right, because Yosef was standing opposite Yaakov. So from Yaakov's perspective, Ephraim was on the right, because that also has a chashivus. Yosef savar shekem shemenashe b'chor Yehu mimin Yisrael afilu shu b'smol shelo u'lezeh Yaakov v'nichol Ephraim b'makom ha'choshev shu yimin shel Yosef also pula nosefes. That's what Rav Druck suggests is each one of them is on a left and each one of them is on a right. It all depends what perspective you're looking, from Yosef or from Yaakov. We're not going to get into it right now. We've discussed it in previous years. What is this machlokas? What is this debate between Yaakov and Yosef about which one takes precedence? Who deserves the greater bracha, Menashe or Ephraim? Menashe is older. So why Ephraim? Why did Yaakov see Ephraim as the answer to the Jewish future, while Yosef thought Menashe was the key to the Jewish future? We've quoted the Shalom Rebbe in the past. Yesterday I learned a beautiful Sicha of the Rebbe with Rabbi Tauger, who actually published the translation of the Sichos of the Rebbe, which is good because it's in Yiddish, so I needed that translation. He has a beautiful perspective, a lot of beautiful perspectives, but I think it's important to include this perspective of Rav Druck, that Yaakov and Yosef each see Menashe and Ephraim as being on their own left or right, depending on what view and what way they're looking at them. Rav Druck then moves on to the next piece, and he asks a great question. He says, I don't understand what's going on here. Yaakov puts his hands on Menashe and Ephraim, and he gives Yosef a bracha, Hamalach HaGoel. And only after that does it say, Vayevarchim Bayomahu Leimor, only after that does he give the bracha to Menashe and Ephraim. So why are we saying he's giving a bracha to Menashe and Ephraim by giving a bracha to Yosef? What in the world's going on? Madua kashum bavarachas Yosef, enu maniach yadav arosha Yosef. Why are his hands on the heads of Menashe and Ephraim while he's giving the bracha to Yosef? If you want to give a bracha to Yosef, put your hands on the head of Yosef. Yesod gadol lamadnu mikan. Says Rav Druck, we learn a really important principle from here. Shabracha amitis la'avi derech habonim. The greatest blessing to a father is through their children. Kashem bavarach Yaakov as Yosef umeniach es yadav al habonim. When Yaakov gives Yosef a bracha, he doesn't put his hand on Yosef's head. He puts his hands on Menashe and Ephraim. Kasher yeshefa ubracha labonim zoe birchas ha'av. When children are successful, when children are thriving, when children are prosperous, when children are on the path, that is the greatest bracha to the parent. So the Zayda, the grandparent, puts his hands on the Einaklach while he blesses his own son, because he says, son, Yosef, you know what the bracha is? Ephraim and Menashe. To have children who are a continuity, to have children who are on fire, to have children who walk in your footsteps. Habracha hamiti shala abba overes derech hayoladim shalo. That is the greatest bracha. That is the greatest bracha. I think it's the Sfas Emes who says, Vayechi shneim yachtav. That's the kosev orchu as b'nei Yisrael, is vani vanar nilcha adko. What is the kosev orchu as b'nei Yisrael? Parshas Naso. The bracha birchas kohanim that we give our children, the bracha birchas kohanim, the kohanim give us. What is that bracha? Yivarech Hashem v'yishmerecha. The kosev orchu as b'nei Yisrael, the Medrash says, the ko, chafei, the cho of kosev orchu as b'nei Yisrael is connected to that vani vanar nelcha ad ko. The Akedah, when Avram says Yitzchak and I are going ad ko, what is the kosev orchu? The greatest bracha is vani vanar nilcha ad ko. When children walk in the footsteps of their parent, when they embrace the derech of their parent, when they give Yiddish nachas, Hasidish nachas, Litvish nachas, every type of nachas to the parent, that is the greatest bracha for the parent. So says Rav Druck, that's how you understand what seems out of sequence in these psukim. Who's he giving the bracha to? Is it to Yosef, or is it to Yosef's sons? Why are his hands on the heads of the sons if he's giving the bracha to Yosef? Why does it seem interrupted? What's going on? Says Rav Druck, it's all mixed together, because the greatest bracha to a parent is to have successful children who walk in their same path. Why do we choose Ephraim and Menashe as the recipients of our bracha? Vayevarchem bayomahu leimor. Give him a bracha on that day, saying Vayevarchem. Says the Sasaver Vayevarchem. You know what the bracha is? Bayomahu. Always live in the moment, live in that day. B'chol Yavarch Yisrael leimor. The Jewish people will bless through you. Yisimcha lakim b'Ephraim b'Menashe. Vayasmas Ephraim l'fnei Menashe. So, what in the world's going on here? First of all, why are Menashe and Ephraim chosen? This is an age-old question. We've discussed this many times, but I want to add on something new this year. Why are Menashe and Ephraim chosen? We give our kids a bracha. I love, and I'm running out of time, otherwise I would elaborate and describe to you a Masorah I have from my father, that my father, for a long time already, gives us all brachas. We're grown children, wherever we are in the world. In absentia, he gives us a bracha. Friday night, closes his eyes, he extends his hands, and wherever we are, he gives us a bracha. And we've, too, I give a bracha to my children every Friday night. Baruch Hashem, I have several who've grown and are graduated, and I give them a bracha every Friday night. And it's the greatest bracha to also close your eyes and think about your einaklach, your grandchildren, and give them a bracha as well. So if you would have asked me to choose from Tanakh, if you would have asked me to choose from Chazal, who should we bless and that be like? Maybe Hillel, such a righteous person. Maybe Rabbi Akiva gave his life. Maybe Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Maybe Moshe and Aaron, Yosef, David. All Ephraim and Menashe, two rather minor characters of the Torah. That's who we bless like. So we've given many answers before. Number one, we said these are the first two who are born in Chutz La'aretz. They're born outside of Israel. They're born away from a Jewish education. They're born away from their Zayda, their grandfather Yaakov. And yet, they are steadfast. They never compromise. They remain true. And that's a bracha to our children. Be like Ephraim and Menashe. You're growing up in Golus. You're growing up in exile. You're growing up in a world, in an environment which is foreign, which is difficult. Persevere. Be like Ephraim and Menashe, number one. Number two suggestion is that Ephraim and Menashe are the first generation to get along. First ones. Yaakov, Yitzchak and Yishmael didn't get along. Yaakov and Esav doesn't get along. Yosef and his brothers don't get along. Ephraim and Menashe, you're the first ones. Not only do they get along, Ephraim, the younger brother, is considered greater than his older brother. Is Menashe jealous? Is he competitive? No. Menashe is proud. That's the bracha we give our children. That's the bracha we give our children. Be proud and realize who you're meant to be. But I want to tack on a third interpretation. This comes from Rabbi Druck. This is new this year. And I love this, and I'm going to think about this. Why do we give a bracha to be like Menashe and Ephraim more than any of these other personalities? Sort of Druck quotes his father, the Drash Mordechai, Rav Mordechai Druck, Zatzal, Shnei rak Avram Yitzchak Yaakov Nikraim Avos v'lo Ashvatim. Only Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are called our patriarchs. The 12 tribes are not. Like the Gemara says, Ein Korin Avos al Shlosha. V'hu misham Yeridas Hadoros. And why is that? Because we have the doctrine of the decline. We have this notion that every generation is further removed from God, from Sinai. Every generation, there's further decline. So the Avos, they are the Avos. They are the archetypes. The Avos, only Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are called the Avos. And while the Shvatim are great, they're a step down because there's decline. There's a Yeridas Hadoros. Chazal tells the Gemara Shabbos Kaf Yud Beis, Im Rishonim Kamalachim Anu K'bnei Adam. If the earlier generations were like angels, we are mere mortals. There is a doctrine of decline, Yeridas Hadoros. We're on our way down. Who broke that mold? Who broke that mold and didn't decline, but was on the ascent? Ephraim and Menashe. What do I mean? Says the Drash Mordechai, says Rav Druck's father, Rav Mordechai Druck, Yaakov just said, Ephraim and Menashe, Keruben v'Shimon Yehuli. They are not the next generation. They're not grandchildren. They have the status of Shvatim. They're like Reuben and Shimon. Even though they were grandsons, they were given the status of sons. They didn't decline. They didn't go down. They were Bnei Aliyah. They went up. So says Rav Mordechai Druck, you know the bracha we give. I can't wait to think about this Friday night. The bracha we give to be like Ephraim and Menashe, that bracha is, may you be greater than I am. Everyone else is on their way there, and you read this Hadoros. This is a bracha to be even greater. A bracha to be even greater. And Babir Zeyish Levaris Mashikos B'Targum Yonason. The Targum Yonason says in this pasuk, B'cha Yivarach Yisrael B'yomad Mahalusa. When should this bracha be given? Targum Yonason says, Yaakov is telling him, you know what, Ephraim and Menashe, the greatness of Ephraim and Menashe, you will use them as the model to bless others. When? Which day? He doesn't say Friday night. Very unclear when that custom of giving a bracha to our children on Friday night began. But when does the Targum Yonason say you should bless to be like Ephraim and Menashe? On the day of a bris. That's when the bracha to be like Ephraim and Menashe is on the day of a bris. Madu davka yom bris ulafid varin umavor. Shadavka b'mitzvah harishon shadam osel no harei umavarach v'amal no shkmosh kiyom mitzvah zu etzlo yam shelkaim kol mitzvos. So says Rav Druck, you know why the Targum Yonason is saying specifically on the day of a bris you should give the bracha to be like Menashe and Ephraim? Because that's the first mitzvah they're encountering. So what we're telling that child, that little rachanimo, that little baby boy, is the same way that you have come into this mitzvah, your first mitzvah, so too in every mitzvah may you surpass those who come before. So I'll just add on that my uncle, Zichron Lavracha, Rabbi Elazar, my uncle once said at a bris, maybe that's the pshat in what we say, Ze'akatan gadol yihiyeh. May this child go great. What do we mean? Right now he's 6 inches long, may he be 6 feet tall. Right now he weighs a few ounces, may he weigh 170 pounds. What do you mean Ze'akatan, this little pitzkala, gadol yihiyeh, may he be large? Is that what we mean? Said my uncle, no. Ze'akatan gadol mimeni yihiyeh. May this one who right now is less than me, gadol, may he be greater. You know, you have some parents who say, I come to Shul Shabbos morning at 10 a.m. I don't want my children to come earlier than 10. I keep this level of kashrus. I don't want them to keep any more scrupulous level of kashrus. I only earn this money. I only achieve this education. I only this. I want them to succeed, but exactly where I am. I want them to be where I am religiously. I want them to be where I am politically. I want them to be where I am in my education. That's not a Jewish view. Rather, our attitude is, Ze'akatan gadol mimeni yiyeh. May this katan who's right now less than me, gadol, may he grow greater than me. Ephraim and Menashe are the first model of that. Kiruvan v'Shimon Yili. What a beautiful insight of the Drash Mordechai. That's why we invoke them. That's why we choose them. That's why they are our model. B'cha Yevoich Yisrael. I can't believe that we have to end with this. Just so you know, I got halfway through what I wanted to share. Literally halfway through. But Baruch Hashem, there's a Parshas Vayechi next year. But I'll close with a Divrei Yisrael. Rabbi Chezkel of Kushmir, my friend Rabbi Mirzov, shared with me. The Divrei Yisrael of Kushmir says, B'cha Yevoich Yisrael, Lo Amar B'chem. When he turns to Menashe and Ephraim, he doesn't say B'chem. It's really plural. There's two people. Shouldn't he say B'chem Yevoich Yisrael? Why is it B'cha? B'cha ki ish echad ba'achtos va'az ein hevdal mikodem lemi. Only if you're united, you will be the model, and you will be the one through whom blessing comes if you are united, if you are as one. Because when you're united, you're not competitive. When you are unified, you don't care about who comes first. Ulefichach vayasam es Ephraim lefnei Menashe ki Menashe lo yikaneh be'Ephraim shoy shneim ke'echad. Because Ephraim wasn't jealous of Menashe. They were united and they were unified. And therefore, the bracha is not B'chem Yivarach Yisrael, says the Divrei Yisrael. It's B'cha. You as one entity, as one unit, you as one united. If we really want bracha in our lives, if we want bracha for our children, then we cannot be cutting corners. We cannot be using protectia. We cannot certainly be doing, unfortunately, like a huge chilul Hashem and trying to go out of order and out of line. But a person has to rather be united. A person has to act menschlich. If you want bracha, first you need achtos. Not b'chem, but b'cha yivarech. And that's how we are able to achieve bracha in our lives. There was and is a lot more to talk about if you're watching on YouTube, but please subscribe to our channel. Even if you're not, feel free to go to Rabbi Efrem Goldberg on YouTube and subscribe. Otherwise, stay happy, stay healthy, and stay holy. Have a wonderful and holy day. We continue tomorrow morning, 8:15, 10 minutes of Mesilas Yesharim, 8:45, Living with Emunah. Tomorrow night we go behind the Bima. Have a phenomenal day.